So we're at the end of this lesson. Let's wrap up, talk about some of the things we've learned. We first looked at Azure AD users and groups, how to add them in the portal manually using portal pages, also how to do bulk operations. So getting a CSV template file, adding the rows to the file, and then uploading those directly into the portal. We looked at Azure AD devices, registered devices, joined, and hybrid joined. You should keep in mind the kinds of operating systems that are supported by each so that you can understand and answer questions about what kind of join type would be appropriate given a client operating system. We looked at a feature of Azure AD called Self-Service Password Reset, which allows users to change their passwords in the cloud. It does have effects for on-prem AD synchronization, as we discussed in Password Writeback. Finally, I want to say a word about command line information. You will likely see a few questions on your exam that require you to recognize a correct version of a PowerShell or an Azure CLI command. And so what I will do at the end of each lesson is take you through some example commands to give you a flavor of how these commands work. If you're new to PowerShell or the CLI, you'll get the hang of it fairly quickly, I think. So to do that, I'm going to switch to the browser, open up a new page. The best thing to do to study for this is to go to docs.microsoft.com. This is the documentation site for all of Microsoft products. If you scroll down, you'll see Azure here. So from here, below all the information about the services, you'll find languages and tools. And we're going to spend a little time looking at Azure PowerShell and Azure CLI. So I'm going to open CLI in a new tab. I'll open PowerShell here. There's information here about how to install PowerShell and how to get it working and so forth. I want to focus down in the reference section. So down in reference, if you scroll down, you can quickly see dozens, many dozens of choices just based on the kind of feature you want to work with. Let's go look at Active Directory. So under Active Directory, you'll find a list of all the commands that relate to Active Directory in PowerShell. So PowerShell commands always begin with a verb, add or get or new, remove, sometimes delete, update. So that's one clue as to the kind of command you would need to understand. Let's scroll down to new AZ AD user. Oh, another thing I'd like to point out too is all Azure PowerShell commands have the letters AZ after the dash. So new AZ AD user creates a new Active Directory user. You don't really need to memorize all the properties for these, but if you get a flavor for what they're asking, I think you'll be able to recognize what you see on a test question. So here's a new AZ AD user, setting the display name, setting the user principal name, which is the login ID, and setting a password. So that's one example. There's also a new AZ AD group. So AZ AD groups, a group needs a display name, possibly a male nickname. How do you add members to a group? That's get AZ. Let's scroll up. Add AZ AD group member. So we're adding a member to a group. I'll scroll down to an example. Here we're adding group member by object ID. This one's a little friendlier. Pipes it, well, that's by member object ID. Here's the friendly one, add AZ AD group member, member user principal name, and then target group display name. So I recommend that you spend a little time in the documentation for a given section or lesson in our course. Go and look up PowerShell commands and just scan them. You don't need to memorize all of the choices, but once you get accustomed to the verbs that are used for the action you're trying to take, and you understand some of the terminology that Azure AD uses, then I think you'll be able to answer those questions. Let's talk about the Azure CLI. So this is another command line you can use to access Azure. PowerShell works traditionally on Windows. The CLI can also be installed on Linux and Mac OS machines. So the structure of the CLI command is different. So whereas PowerShell starts with a verb, a dash, AZ, and then whatever the command is, you'll find in CLI that you always start with AZ. So that takes you into Azure. And then following that is the feature or the service you want to work with. So AZ space AD gets us into a hierarchy that allows us to work with the AD portion of the CLI. So I would expect to find something down here about users. I'll keep scrolling. Here's AZ AD user. And in fact, there's AZ AD user create, AZ AD user delete. So you see the hierarchical nature of the CLI commands, I think make it fairly readable and easy to understand. If you go into AZ AD user, you can see that many of the property names are the same as you would find in the PowerShell command as well. So if you're not a CLI person, doesn't matter, I don't think. If you find a question on the test like this, I think it'll be fairly straightforward what module you're using once you understand the abbreviations, and then what feature of that module you're using, and then usually a verb towards the end that tells you what it is you're going to do with that item.